Welcome to video number 7 on the Cognihension channel. Dr. Spankenstein speaks. If you like the video, push the button, send us some Bitcoin. We never solicit, but these videos are expensive. I'm going to start with a technical preamble. This is about discovering a better gravity formula. By now my loyal audience may know that the volume of Uranus and Neptune is published at 57 to 86 and respectively 63 times Earth's volume, and mass is 14.5 times, which is 1,270 kilograms mass per cubic meter. If it's all methane, it really would weigh 0.75 kilograms per cubic meter, or 75 grams per centimeter. Earth is thought to weigh 5,510 kilograms per cubic meter. At 0.244 times 5510, the ratio exposes 1,331 grams per centimeter. About twice the mass of methane. That fits better. The mass of Earth is 5510 grams per centimeter cubed, is really the density of lead divided by 2.0689, half the density of lead. So to begin my work, I had to add this preamble and briefly say that because lead was used to arrive at the universal gravity constant in various experiments beginning in 1770, which kept validating each other until I just exposed them as frauds, this work will be done under constraints of not knowing the true mass of any planet. If the current mass of Earth is correct, the cubic meter would weigh 12,122 pounds. That would be more than 3 times the saltwater ocean's density, and it would be very, very heavy. It is definitely not that massive. I will be calling the planet Uranus as Eurus, the Eye of Horus guiding star. It has been discovered to have 21-year days. Its axis points into the sun's plane. The discoverer was a recent immigrant musician to England from Germany, and the English Polymath Society disrespected the discoverer's right to name Eurus. It took 9 years until 1800 to even get the discovery approved. And meanwhile, Cavendish, 1777 to 1779, hyped his gravity apparatus. Later, this universal constant, as he called it, was modified by John Mitchell, who had designed Cavendish's device. Newton published in 1680 some thought concepts, and up to 1728, history records that he used the same universal gravity constant, but never made publication in any versions until after his death by his survivors. This historic classic formula is the constant universal G times m1 times m2, and that quantity all divided by the square of the distance between the masses. The Romans never had a cult to Eurus. It was a Greek god. Zeus would have been the god of the sky. But the weirdness of theories keeps accelerating along with the published mass and volume modifications and a long heritage of mistakes. History shows a running failure because Newton's laws of motion say that an object moves in a straight line unless acted on by a force. The planets, the curved elliptical paths like a race car on an oval track run. The parallels of Uranus, naming choice. But the theory of gravitation was silently contrived to explain why the 8 planets move more at the apogee or longest distance from the sun, especially with Eurus, which counter-rotates on like a unicycle running around the sun. It is seemingly impossible. Einstein, along with Kurt Gödel at Princeton and the Norwegian Gunnar Nordstrom, had equations that worked like little springs to retain the energy over apogee to perigee time using space as a recurring timeline. Edgar Arthur Milne had a theory of gravity becoming weaker as it ages, like a backwash against itself, similar to when the opposite side of the Earth from the moon was exactly the same high tide at the same time, or similar to what Newton's bucket of water comparison, in which he tried to explain that the space outside the bucket was more relative to the action of waves in the bucket and the distance from the spoon that stirs the bucket to the center axis, which seems counterintuitive, but that's the way he wanted space to be defined. And Einstein argued the opposite. Quantum added spin as a source of output without inputs, but they actually absorbed, as they are known to resonate two long-pass filters of light pulses every fifth, third, and second pulse, depending on the crystal structure of the lattices. This is a synergy between coherent light and the matrix lattice. Crystals self-organize and violate the laws of entropy, which were published in 1824 as the Carnot cycle by Nicolas Carnot from France to apply to heat transfers and flows. Philip von Jolly, the mid-1800s, seemed to validate the Cavendish-Newton universal G as he used an enormous ball of lead. I can cite my non-thermal cycle for repeating pattern force reactions, paired invariant coupled transcendental gravity radiations, which is equal to the quantity 1 divided by the square root of 2 times 5 n quantity, divided by the quantity 1 divided by the square root of 2 n quantity times 3 plus, or divided by the quantity 1 divided by the square root of 2 n quantity times 2 n quantity divided by the quantity square root of 1 plus 5, 1 divided by 5 n quantity divided by 2 n quantity times the square root of 2 n quantity divided by 2.379 equals 6.0000, which exposes a hypothesis that there can be two simultaneous three-dimensionals involved somehow. Another form of which this formula can be written is the square root of 5 divided by the square root of 3 divided by the square root of 2 n quantity, divided by the quantity 1.6180339 times the square root of 2 n quantity divided by 2.35, or the quantity of the square root of 5 divided by the square root of 3 divided by the square root of 2 n quantity divided by the quantity 1.618033913.875 times the square root of 2 divided by 2.35 equals 1.0009. Using the equation for phi, the golden ratio limit of Fibonacci numbers, the quantity the square root of 5 plus the square root of divided by the square root of 3 divided by the square root of 2 divided by the quantity 1.6180339 times the square root of 2 and quantity divided by 2.3521 equals 1.000279. IC factor 2.35 taken times 1.61803391875 exactly is the same result as 2.3521 times 1.618033913.875 divided by the square root of 2 times 2.3470734141 equals 6.316187703, which shows resonant activity in the Great Pyramid divided by the universal G of the cosine of 50.83 degrees, the apothic angle of 0.63168177703, combined with a factor of 10. You can use 77033 if you wish to nullify the error. It is more of one bit shifting examples, meaning of course that we've come out here with not the cosine of the apothic angle, but rather 10 times 6.316187703 in the last factor formula. The hypothesis implication is possibly a crystal top piece on the Great Pyramid, but connected to an internal water supply by wire to amplify the effects of phi, squaring being equal to 1 divided by 5 10 times. I should also comparison derive my universal G of 0.6316187703 by 2.35 times 1.618033913.875 divided by the square root of 2 times 2.349169 equals 6.3 0.161836, which is an error of negative 0.00004103. From which we see this value divided by the error of 0.0009 error is a 0.00456, and they are offsetting errors arising from using two decimal place accuracies 2.35. This kind of accuracy appears to be an echo of the 5-cycle, 3-cycle, and 2-integer coherent laser light pulse intermittencies of lattice materials. My experiments tell me that these are the dominant modes of cyclic induced forces in these particles. Less than half of all particles and accelerators respond to gravity. I say that these repeating pattern molecular bodies with simple repeating structures and even integer Fibonacci cycle actions that are synchronized by spin-up, spin-down quantum entanglement. Remember, I have a picture model of a gravity radiation paired invariant coupled transcendental gravity radiation. If new research and the mass distance of gas ice planets holds true, then that results may coincide with spin-up, spin-down flipping. After I list a series of planets and their ratio of predicted forces to modern measures by space probe flyby observations, I'll begin to see what is needed to be done over the next 2 centuries to turn the common misconception of formula upside down. Mass of Eurus 8.681 times 10 to the 25th is the term 1 mass of 1.989 exponent to the 30 is sun's distances. That is 150 to 151.2 million kilometers distance of sun to Earth. 2.946 times 10 to the 9th kilometers to sun to Uranus, and millions of kilometers of Eurus to sun is 2,946.3 million kilometers. This can be written several ways to resolve Earth's mass. For one way is the quantity 0.6694 times 10 to the minus 11th times the quantity 8.681 times 10 to the 25th and quantity times 1.989 times 10 to the 30th and quantity divided by the quantity 2.9463 times 10 to the 9th and quantity times the quantity 15 million kilometers and quantity squared. This yields 5.91771 times 10 to the plus 11th. Notice that 5.972 e exponented 24 times is Earth's mass, which means that 5.972 times 10 to the 24th divided by the quantity 5.9172 times 10 to the 11th is equal to 1.009 times 10 to the 13th. This introduces Earth mass to this discussion as Earth's gravity using Newton's method, which he based on a scale of 1 to 10 trillion, 10 to the 13th. Even though the mass of Earth is not accurate, to be useful, the billion was converted to 10 trillion term, and it seems to be a substitution of 1 plus the quantity 5.91771 times 10 to the 11th and quantity divided by 3.14159 times 0.5 and quantity up to the minus 2 and quantity equals 6.84868 exponent negative 13. Then divide that by 2 pi and you get 1.09000 or 1 over 10.09 trillion. That is the scale of range of farthest masses to Earth's mass. It seems that the ratio of Eurus volume to Neptune's cubic volume, 1.096866, was known, and that those two volumes were close multiples of the Earth's volume. Neptune, 6.235 times 10 to the 13th kilometer cubed. Eurus, 6.833 times 10 to the 13th kilometer cubed, using Earth's volume as 1,082,932 cubic kilometers. 63,110.92 and 57,587.675 respectively for the 60,349 average Neptune ratio to Eurus multiples of Earth's volume. The below glass transition temperatures of these planets are 10.968 and 10.9938 times the diameters, while being up to 86 times Earth's volume. It's the second example of bit shifting by a factor of 10. By range, I mean the planet Eurus as a reference point in the stability disk of the solar system. I consider Earth to be a planet on the edge of the near field, or outer edge of the reach of the sun's gravitation, which our modern spacewalks have shown conclusively that a planet field of inward force only exerts a few multiples of the planet's diameter around the planet. Eurus is a curvature modality axis-oriented ice giant. Since the golden ratio of Fibonacci limit is equal to 1 plus the square root of 5 in quantity divided by 2, then also 5 divided by 1.618033 equals 3.0901, which in turn adds credibility to how the third harmonic arises from the fifth harmonic in the newest experiments with coherent light. Earth mass is 23.898 for older order of magnitude, or 1.04 later comparison to my universal G. This can be found with the formula, the quantity 1 times 10 to the 13th n quantity divided by the quantity 5.91771 times 10 to the 11th n quantity divided by 0.07071 equals 23.89. Because 1 times 10 to the 13th times 5.9 times 10 to the 11th equals 5.9 times 10 to the 24th, which is Earth's mass. If you use 1.00 times 10 to the 13th and not 1.009 times 10 to the 16th, now notice that 1.009 is also 1.646575 divided by 1.6316187703, which may arise from the violet photon electron volts, evolts, divided by the red photon evolts equals 1.646575. Also, the violet 3.005 eV divided by red 1.825 eV of 1.646575. If we add 1 to my universal G and divide it by 1.646575 to get 1.0091, this matches the scale of range of farthest planets of masses of Earth's to Earth's mass, which is 1.090000 up to the 10th power equals 1.0948. So now this is what you can get if you break apart the m1 times m2 of the r squared term and then factor back in the Earth's distance scalar. Looking at Eurus and factoring in Earth. A later reference Cavendish uses 5.9 times 10 to the minus 9th, not minus 11. 8.68 times 10 to the 18th, not the 25th for r squared. First take 0.6674 times 10 to the minus 11th times the quantity 8.618 times 10 to the 25th n quantity times the quantity 1.98 times 10 to the 30th n quantity equals about 1.147 to 1.1506 times 10 to the 45th. To get similar old Cavendish G times M1 times M2 of 1.1521267 times 10 to the 45th, but not using the much newer 0.6694 times 10 to the minus 11, 1.1523 to the exponent 45 divided by 2.9463 times 10 to the 9th squared equals 1.3243 exponent to the 26 times. But then try 1.558 exponent 45 divided by the quantity 8.68 times 10 to the 25th and quantity times the quantity 150 million and quantity squared equals 590.01. Notice that the later reference old Cavendish is 10 to the minus 11th times 590, which was originally used with the 8.68 times 10 to the 18th, when here we used 8.68 times 10 to the 25th with later reference old Cavendish instead. The result is then later reference old Cavendish universal G constant shifted to minus 11 instead of 5.9 times 10 to the minus 9th, 2 orders of magnitude less. The point is that we first multiplied by the mass of Eurus. Then in the second step, we divided by the same number to cancel it out completely. We substituted instead Earth's r squared term. Let's just see then what the Great Pyramid constant adjustment. It's like this. The quantity 1.6898 times 10 to the minus 10th and quantity times the quantity 63161877703 to get 1.067. I use the 1.689 form now, which is even newer versus older 0.6694 times 10 to the minus 11th. And this is significant not only because it validates the cosine of the apothic pyramid angle, but it also matches the ratio of Jupiter mass to Sun mass, which averages about 1,067 multiples as the basis of beginning to discuss non-dimensional scalars and disk stability. Briefly, there's a difference in what gets used as the 1880s estimate of the universal gravity constant of about 1.61 times 10 to the minus 10th. It varies from 0.611 to 0.6316 or 0.6898 to 0.6694. But the standard has changed to be stated as an integer followed by the decimal place rather than a 0 and then a decimal place, called the scientific notation. Well, let's do a Winkelstein computation. If we take the quantity 1.9 times 10 to the 27ths and divide it by 4.246, we get 4.4748 times 10 to the 26th. And we adjusted Jupiter's mass by 4.24 times because in 1880, they may well have assumed the density of Earth for Jupiter. So now this 4.4748 times 10 to the 26 times the quantity 7071 times the quantity 1.99 times 10 to the 30th and quantity, we have the M1 times M2 of Sun and Jupiter, 6.2966 times 10 to the 56. Now, M2, M1 divided by 0.7071, which is r squared, is equal to 6.2966 times 10 to the 56 divided by the quantity 1 divided by the square root of 2 times 7420000 squared and quantity equals 1.76 times 10 to the 24th. First, universal gravity, the quantity is 616 times 10 to the 10th and quantity divided by the quantity 1.76 times 10 to the 24 and quantity equals 3.5 times 10 to the negative 15th. And then 3.5 times 10 to the 10th to the 24th, we could do then 1 divided by 1.76 times 10 to the 24th equals 5.681 times 10 to the minus 25. 5.681 times 10 to the minus 25.63 times 63161877703 minus 515 divided by the quantity 0.616 times 10 to the negative 11th equals 0.00568. Alternatively, also starting with 1.76 times equals 3.587 times 10 to the minus 15th. And the quantity 3.5587 times 10 to the minus 15th and quantity divided by 616 times 10 to the minus 11th equals 0.00058. Thus, to set up a reasonable comparison directly, I'll offer the same example or verbal directions. Take Cavendish, Newton, Einstein, Mitchell, early universal constant G, 6.694 times 10 to the minus 11th times the metric kgs mass of Eurus times the mass of the Sun. Then the mass 1 times mass 2 of universal, the late 1700s constant G. See this on the side to use after the next step. Secondly, we're going to divide that starting with its distance from the gravity source, the Sun, multiplied by the distance of Earth. Now, square or multiply times itself, the Earth to Sun times Eurus to Sun to get the gravity, to get the radius squared. Lastly, divide that number by M1, M2 by that distance. Because of the 1877 term gravity constant, it is a 10 to the minus 11th term. It turns into billions of kilograms of force. Kilograms, 5,917,711 1,624. And now flip it over. 1 divided by 5.917 billion equals 1.68984 times 10 to the minus 10th. Then multiply that by the my great universal G from the pyramid times a billion. You get 1.07. That's sweet. This all starts to make some sense, right? Now remember when we get the 5.918 times 10 to the 9th for reference old Cavendish of 1.1158 e to the 45 divided by the quantity 8.68 times 10 to the 18th times the n quantity times 150 million squared. So this is why flipping or wintling this result times the cosine of the apothic angle works out to be 1.067 using 6.694 times 10 to the minus 11th as a universal G. Of course, the point is that if you divide 2,870,658,168 kilometers by Friedrich, aka William Herschel's 1871 Earth radius of orbit, or 94,474,000 kilometers radius for antique kilometers radius of orbit, you would get 30.38. But in miles, you would become 31.7 from 2954 divided by 92.9 millions of miles, not kilometers, orbit ratios. Yet orbit circumference, I've seen one differential equation in QA formulas as 9.39885,431 e to the plus 11th, which is a greater orbit distance by 921,946,576,690 to 938,942,953,203 kilometers. This ratio would be 997.249 from this strange calculus. And it should be a power of 8. This error in math results as a ratio of distance taken from 9.39885,431 times 10 to the 11th divided by the quantity of 150 million kilometers radius. The original, which is a multiple of pi times 10 here, is another bit shifted ratio, 3.14 versus 31.04 average old orbit radius of Earth orbits to average distance radius. A perfect circle average orbit circumference would arbitrarily be 6.28 times 10 to the 8th. But strangely, you will also see it published as a multiple just over 29. So what you don't see is relativity to other geometric methods. If you look closely at the difference in distance between using English, it took like two different ratios. But really either system, if consistent with itself, would not result in much difference in any Earth to Eurus measurement ratios. But then as the value of my new Winkelstein adjustment Eurus mass is about 8.681 times 10 to the 25th at a distance of 2.946 times 10 to the 9th kilometers. The next outer brother, Neptune. Mass is 1.024 times 10 to the 26 at 4.4742 times 10 to the 9th kilometers. The world is still using the antique 1777 or the latest up to maybe 1779 math for that gravitation computation, as far as I can tell. My word Wintel strangely appeared right about that same time in 1780, about a year after that Neptune calculation was established. That was just a computation of the mass 1 and mass 2 divided by r squared. And it equals 1.989 times 10 to the 30th times the mass of Eurus would be 8.681 times 10 to the 25th equals 1.72665 times 10 to the 56th. Then that times Newton's G factor is 1.1524 times 10 to the 46 for Eurus. So force equals that quantity divided by 2.946 times 10 to the 9th squared. And then that is 1.327 times 10 to the 27 kilograms. So that it has about 15 times greater than mass. So do this the same way. We use the exponentially 56th number, 1.72665, divided by the quantity, 2.946 times 10 to the 9th, n quantity times 0.7071, n quantity squared, n quantity equals 3.979 times 10 to the 37th kilogram. And that, remember, is divided by 0.6316187703. I'm using that as scaled to 10 to the 11th to get 2.513 times 10 to the 26th, which is 2.895 times the mass of Eurus. So M1, M2 for Neptune is 2.0357 times 10 to the 56 times 6.667 times 10 to the minus 11 is 1.35789 times 10 to the 46. So let's use that result and M1, M2, so that force equals that divided by 4.47 divided by 4.47 times 10 to the 9th squared, and then that equals to 6.783 times 10 to the 26. Or else let's Wittgenstein that adjusted by the square root of 2 divided by 2 times r squared, and we get 9.611 times 10 to the 26 kilograms. Gravity, and this fits the better volume estimates for both Eurus and Neptune, being 11 times Earth's volume, and they're about half their order of magnitude, 10 to the 13th of the calculated gravity forces to their ratio volumes, 10 to the 26 units of force. By Newton's G, the Neptune numbers are 2.008 times the gravity of the Sun to Eurus numbers. That seems a little bit odd. But by Wittgenstein, we get 1.95. However, to compare the forces to just planet masses, the unadjusted ratio is 1.95547. Likewise, that adjusted pair can be 1.9517. Using relative distances here, those planets are only 1.58 distance planet ratio A to B versus an average of 1.95 relative forces. So this is a 1.236 force to distance of the force. But Eurus is 14.853 times further from the Sun than the Earth is. So my adjustment tends to remain unnoticed for these large planets because the distances of the Wittgenstein difference diminishes with the square of the radius. It's a bit imperfect. I will show why my mass and force of gravity as a ratio may become stable at the end of this video. It can become a lot of math. However, if we do the same thing for Earth and Jupiter, we get the ratio of Earth 7.9166 times 10 to the 44th divided by the quantity 150 million kilometers squared, or 3.518 times 10 to the 28th. Now that's unadjusted by Wittgenstein, or 4.976 times 10 to the 28th adjusted for Wittgenstein's stabilized g-forces, and for Jupiter we get 2.108 times 10 to the 47th divided by 2.946 times 10 to the 9th squared, and that equals 2.429 times 10 to the 28th unadjusted, or 3.435 times 10 to the 28th adjusted. So in many cases the error is not so bad. So the ratio is the same, 1.448 stable adjusted versus 1.448 unadjusted ratios of stabilized gravity forces. I'm interested in the planet's mass and what it does to make a stabilization adjustment to get energy like units instead of just distances and masses. Planetary energy is acting like it is being needed to retain motion rather than a weak force that is just radiated or diminishes to nothing as the radius distance is squared. Even these commonly really overstated masses that are poorly weighted quasi-measurements with no actual validation can be worked with to some extent. The 4.9533 Jupiter is 4.946 kilometers times Earth to the Sun, as distance between them, for example. That distance ratio of Jupiter to Earth's orbit radius divided by Earth's adjusted g-force is 4.976 e to the 28th, which is almost exactly a ratio similar to the kilometers of Earth from the Sun to the Jupiter. The Earth radius divided by the Earth's adjusted g-force is 4.796 e to the 28th. That force ratio divided by 4.9533 radius ratio to get Earth's force to g-scalar is 10.004 octillion, which is 10 to 27 zeros after it in units of kilograms per kilometer. But think of it as just one almost exactly good scalar ratio. At average, Saturn is 9.33 times distance from the Earth as from the Sun. However, this is also published sometimes as an apogee with 839 million kilometers perigee. A wave with a peak of 1 has a scalar area under that curve of 0.7071. This is the version that makes picture so compelling a method, in addition to fitting the sine wave and the groundbreaking equations of 5, 3, and 2 delay seen in energy optical physics crystal containing materials. Dolomite rock is an example. It's only formed on impacts of large objects from space, but it was used in the Great Pyramid as much as they could possibly find, and it was quite a feat to find that at all, much less to quarry. It's very heavy and very tough stuff to work with. The skewed results from large pairs of lead balls or a single one like Von Jolly did is not the kind of material that was the framework to look at gravity with, especially not as a negative force. It comes from the larger body as a source. In his model, the smaller body was 100% reacting to the large mass of the larger body. It was not intended to be reciprocal. And yet, the stability of all the planets depends on the other planets. For another example, the mass of Neptune to Earth today is listed as about 17.15 times Earth mass, at the same time that Neptune is also 1.179 times the Earth's mass. Again, a kind of a bit shifting. Neptune is 29.8 times farther from the Sun than the Earth is to the Sun. That Neptune mass divided by 14.85, which is Earth's multiple of distance up from the Sun relative to one's Earth distance, is 2.0063, or the quantity 29.8 divided by 14.853. And that, of course, suggests that there is a stability ratio being maintained between Earth and Neptune. The question is causal effect, and what best matches the evidence. My Winkelstein adjustment works for Earth, but is subject to scalar adjustments for longer radiuses of orbital rotation. The term universal G really never was intended to be a literal reference to the universe at all. Why they used it is a mystery. These early days used this because planet movements were not physical to them, and even today they are very rarely used in physics work at all. It was universal, meaning only universal to people on Earth. So looking at other planets like Saturn, we must divide the Winkelstein results by 10 to the 50th to get 0.244, and that is using 9.333 as astronomical unit distance for Saturn's radius. It looks like 1.1303487 times 10 to the 57th divided by the quantity 9.333 times 7071, 0.667 times 10 to the 11th, and quantity times the quantity 150 million and quantity squared, and that is 2.59283 times 10 to the 61st. Now, with Winkelstein, we could do the same thing. It would look like the quantity 1 divided by the quantity 2.59 times 10 to the 61st, and quantity times the quantity 63161877033 times 10 to the 50th, and quantity equals 0.2438. Remember that we guessed that Earth actually has a density that could be as low as 0.244, and the official 5,510 cubic kilograms per cubic meter, which is matching the 0.2438 of the Wittgenstein on that calculation. Uranus and Neptune are about 0.24 times of Earth. We needed 6316187.033 times 10 to the 50th, in other words, to use to make our proper scalar. This is significant because the average of Uranus at 1,270 kilograms per cubic meter is then 0.23 times Earth's, and Neptune's depth density is 0.24. Remember, I also estimated the Earth density to be 0.24 of what is published today on the internet, which I believe is about half the density of pure lead. I use 0.24 times that as what I believe the reader should also believe is a holdover from the antique wildcat days of Reverend John Mitchell of Cavendish's basement barbell, or barbell on a string apparatus with a pitch calculation model of gravity. No explanation for or visible work has ever been given for why radius is squared in any of the entire category of classic works. It's just supposed to be standing there by itself as a work of mathematical art. And yet Uranus is 11 times the diameter of Earth and spins on its axis once every 9 hours. This factor is more important than distance measures in a flat plane to the Sun. Of course, the extreme spin rate begins at the second to the next planet of Earth, Jupiter. It carries the little-known prediction that even if the 500-mile-an-hour winds do not smash into mechanical probes or landers, then the centrifugal force is also very high and would destroy any robots or probes anyway. Centrifugal force is a poorly understood force. It acts like gravity, but only very near any spinning surface. In past decades, and with relativity theory, the same idea, there may not be any possible zero spin or zero movement object when we talk about large-scale cosmic physics has frequently been discussed. This applies the distribution of gravitational velocities of things like galaxy rotation speed, and it should be considered to match a beta distribution of statistical samples. While that does not mean that the time intervals are correlated in any such data sets of galaxies because of the inseparable time and distance at each measurement, this could not be confused and should not be confused and considered to be anything like the theory of time-space as an elastic viscoelastic media or ether in which objects float, nor should it be considered to be the solar system has with an axis normal to its disk, contracting and compressing in order to allow the formation of some sort of bending of space and time as they relate to the movements. There's no evidence. If the viewer has seen my other videos like form follows function, then I could bring up the idea that instead of bending, the respected optimal in mechanics is a six-sided hexagon shape, stronger than any other shape in torsion, which one more top point makes a 7-node 3D hexagon crystal. And that could be the choice of a good round inward bent funnel rather than a disk. The reason, if you remember, is the constant total length of the interdepth filaments, those filaments being imaginary connections between the points of a six-sided hexagon with the top or bottom seventh element. Those, with respect to the volume and the shape, their solar spin plane that this would exist in is at 60 degrees to the Milky Way in the case of our solar system. It would not be marketing spin or dark matter just to calculate 50.83 degrees minus 60 degrees and get a minimum of 9 degrees offset that we would see in the evidence of this research. Now we begin the white paper, False Cause and Effect in Gravity Theory. And that basically ends the preamble. I'm going to get right into the main body of the paper. I think we've got the hard work has been behind us now. We can have a little more fun. We are living for years now in a renaissance of time theories. In the years from 1988 till now, many theories that adjust the arrow of time from the perspective of quantum mechanics have been censored, their authors expelled, and published, barred from publishing. In years like 1988, the thinking was then vested in the idea that all matter was drawn like gravity effects to the lowest energy state. The Big Bang was seen as only an energy event that could not be said to be steady state, but that as no energy was being created, merely changing states from matter's unstable fields into more entropy-rich mixes of organized matter, and later revised to include releasing the difference in the state of purity as radiation in that secondary heat. Plato studied for years in Egypt and spent his life writing about Hermetic associationism. I said on my other copyright works that gravity is better its relation to time and energy appears to be like a gas cloud if you look at them only as planets of the sun and not the movement of the sun through space. When gas clouds have a charge, they form magnetic domains and are multiply direct current sources. These multiple current sources can combine in concentric spheres, forming a stabilized repulsive field as in levitation systems or railgun circuits. In the 1980s, the academic institution policy was to teach standard models of physics, changing gravity as being a weak force of the atom to later being gravitation. And in 2015, this changed to be a gravity wave. But some institutions that use quantum mechanics continue teaching left chironicity as the cause of gravity according to the standard model. There are many errors in assigning gravity to bent time, bent space or clock ticks or various distances and their variations. To do that, there must be a click of a clock that is not only governed by absolute perfection or normal distribution stable to near infinity over a vast number of cycles, but also a normal distribution center of the same never yet achieved in physical or computational capability. Edward Arthur Milne first postulated this, but also John Bell's challenge to Nordstrom's Einstein metaspace shows that general relativity ignores all variational mathematical principles and repeated sample set procedures. There was none at the time, or many years later they began. Modern statistical methods prove general relativity to be false if it is held up against a beta distribution test or alternative negotiated truths. It is a law of physics that any time-based samples will be skewed in distribution along the long tail in the positive direction. This is because a one-way variate and bivariate samples are different in a fundamental way. Like stationary inertia, there is no zero time interval. The data will always test positive for that much skew. The reasons include: one, gravity is 1 over 10 to the 50th power weaker than electromagnetic waves, which can also never be shielded against at such levels, even in an exquisite laboratory. And two, is not a true measurement to begin with, but would be reproduced in a laboratory, but not in outer space. Dark matter has to be 5 times larger than present gravity force estimations to explain that outer space shows our observations to telescopes. And some say that that can be as large as 8 times. The third reason, to say that relativity as a mental picture in one's mind somehow predicts a path of a falling object to say that you have no material but only time-basis formula that matches the data, that it implies cause. It correlates the factor with itself. This idea space really is violating the definition of space as nothing in order to achieve what is already defined as not material. So consider these 3 points in addition. Number one, consider the difference between gravimetric mass and inertial mass. It was first described in quantum mechanics as gas clouds by Schrodinger. If a square wave, quantum version of a light wave form, has an amplitude of plus and minus 1, then that distance inside the longitudinal wave is at start peak to average in 1/2 cycle distance is then 0.7071 units. If it is plus 1/2 then and minus 1, then its units are in quarks. That distance becomes the square root of the quantity 2 squared n quantity plus the quantity 1 squared n quantity. And that is equal to the square root of 5, or about 2.236. So multiplying that distance by the other half cycle, because it is a half cycle of an equal pulse cycle with to amplitude, and square root of 5 times square root of 5 equals 5. The value of 0.7071 is already here. Note as being 1 over the square root of 2. This has never been correctly conjectured to be the source of the spin of space objects. Briefly, 2 pulses of 1 pulse width unit, and the 1/2 pi area of a triangle yields the square root of the pulse width plus the square root of the area of the distance triangle, and that is equal to 5.0248. 1 divided by the square root of 2 of 7001 now then hang on, is multiplied 4 times this, is 2.8284. So 2.8284 times 5 is then 14.14. A bit shifted square root of 2. 2.8284 divided by the square root of 5 is 1.2648989. So 1.2648989 divided by 0.6316187703, the universal G, is almost precisely 2. It is 2.00. Each photon in the 6316187703 universal G is then each proton and the neutrons of every atom are made up of a pair of up and down quarks. Each has a positive half cycle and a 1/3 unit of energy and a negative of the 2/3 units. But this could mean that from begin pulse width of the square positive wave to begin pulse width of the same negative pulse wave, there is a crossing value of 2 units, even though the waves themselves are each 1 unit. These also, like electrons jumping orbits, are not relative in time, but beyond the ability to measure the time it takes to switch polarity. Just like in number 1, the resulting start of a full cycle to start of next opposite spin or quantum jumps pulse width is also exactly a distance of the square root of 5. From this arises a resonance between 2 sets of 2 quantum jumps. The first from electron location and the second from pairs of quark states, up or down, which is really properly the spin type of each particular quark particle. This, in my opinion, is the most advanced and simple explanation of gravity. And number 2, the recent experiments in fusion reactors show us that black holes, as a bending light or space, is a false cause and effect. It is false because the data show that when plasma is heated 5 times the temperature of our sun, it no longer gives off any light at all. It's a plasma mode star. Besides black holes being another general relativity that is really irrelevant and falls into the classification as a mental revelation, there are real possibilities that many SPMS stars exist in the center of every galaxy, and that could be the 5-fold dark matter that would add in all the missing stars that is predicted by the spin velocities and many unusual galaxies. Also, this opens up the possible solution to the redshift and expanding universe mental revelation as well. As stars age, the energy wavelength turns more red, and the star has less outgoing energy from the core. There is a shrinkage and compression into a more or less plasma state, and it may turn into a very hot superheated plasma star, which then emits zero visible light before it explodes in a supernova. With too much thermal activity, the electron orbitals no longer make the quantum square pulse that makes visible spectrum light. Then if the calculations shown in this paper are a factor in gravity, it will change the distance and intensity relationships. The scalar of 4 is used in relativity both for curvature of light, but 8 is used in the gravitational tensor times universal G. There, G is not the Cavendish G. It is 8 times G n quantity divided by c to the 4th power as a tensor of curvature minus the scalar of curvature is equal to space-time curvature. Still, curviness of space is not a property of gravity. We know that now, but that is to say, relativity, which originates with the Poincare conjecture, a state or asserts really to be a truth of nature. It is not true about gravity as a force, as we have observed since Newton's equations. Newton's force was 9.8 meters per second, not in universal G. It, however, is a strong property of crystals and magnetic forces. The cube of mass directly affects solids accelerated along the circumference of the Earth, but not vertically. Forces are not defined as either waves, square or sinusoidal, or particles. What we can say is that if a triangle formed by the square waves of spin entanglement of waves is resonant, then the circumradius of the 1/2 pi unit area triangle is the square root of 5 divided by 2, and the angle is 26.565 angle, and the beta alpha is 63.435. The area is thus the quantity 1 divided by the square root of 2 n quantity, the quantity 1 divided by the square root of 2 squared times pi, or 1.57079. Also, the quantity 1 divided by the quantity the square root of 2 pi n quantity squared times pi equals 0.250000. This reminds me of my stativity video. The ratio of these angles is therefore 2.3879. Again, it is a repeat of the 2.35 like number. Remember I said in picture, that picture gives us the quantity 1 plus the square root of 2 times 5 n quantity plus the quantity 1 plus the square, divided by square root of 2 times n quantity times 3 plus the quantity 1 plus the square root of 2 n quantity times 2 plus the quantity square root of 1 plus 5 n quantity plus 2 divided by 2 n quantity times the square root of 2 n quantity plus 2.379, and that is equal to 6.0000. So a factor of 2.35 or 2.38 can be resolvable as wave transfer modalities. The disappearing star crisis since the 1950s, at least 800 stars, may not be solvable. If you like astronomy as a hobby, watch the Big Dipper, you can see temporary light of bright stars swell and last for 1 to several seconds to any given length of time and then disappear. The old m1 times m2 ignores the fact that objects of any mass whatsoever fall at the same rate of acceleration. Therefore, Newton was saying one thing, doing another thing mathematically in private versus published formulas. Sadly, Newton missed the symbolism of the Great Pyramid entirely. Like a spinning four-leaf clover with no direction of sunlight or gravity. fourth point, the only directional pivot may prove to be from the supermassive plasma stars of the galaxy, such that from this immense mass rotation rate comes its spin rate of the universe, and it determines the plus and minus constants of gravity. The pyramids show that if there is no true single stationary inertial system, then the structure of matter would be considered to be floating or drifting always. And that should be the first law of dynamics for a newer theory of universe coordinate data systems. Clouds of dark plasma may exist and also redshift more distant starlight, leading to a false conclusion that space expands as well as curves. Otherwise, the relativistic thinkers say there could be no logic-based reasoning that is able to determine otherwise. The resemblance of a tomb inside the pointer towards the dark, holy other world, they say is as above, so below. But we are in the above of the universe. A supermassive wintoplasma star is below. As the light shines from above, it does well from below for star systems with planets. Every time some relativity champion pretends this misinformation, such as a 7-mile air GPS location per day would exist without relativity theory, I wonder which form of the solution Mileva, Merrick, Minkowski, Einstein, and Marcel Grossman, Nordstrom, or Gödel. Only the idea of deformed motion was completely original to Einstein, and his formula for light bending of gravity, well, which is the angle is equal to 4 times the quantity gm, gravity times mass, and quantity, divided by c squared and quantity. I cannot find no information about the idea of universal G that in fact obtained from the last formula using Sn, the mass m. This would mean that the entire Cavendish and Newton G constants were in parallel development of a machine that would show the same constant or eclipse of sun measurement, while not yet knowing an approximation of the speed of broad spectrum light in a vacuum. There is, of course, the usual hype towards the big historic theories. Such things as why the Big Bang, by definition, is a completely pure state, would then give birth to many other pure states and lose the information. It is just a more modern narrative. We also do not even know if more energy is required to speed up an object or an electrical force, when experience tells us that space is an infinite field that behaves to react or to respond in empty space as if it, space, were the dominant response role, not speed, independently of energy, density, synergies, and the predefined space frame of reference, i.e. a rocket engine emits gas and moves forward, but there is no mechanical connection except a thrust plate contacting the gas. In physics, volts equals force divided by current. But as circuit energy volts equals resistance to force times current. Hence, force and resistance to force cancel, and radial volts equals axial volts. This is derived from in forms like non-inductive resistor windings, but there has never been a white paper that says the two forces must be equal. In all the pre-1955 statistics, the root mean square of the metric variation was prone to error. This ratio matters because if you take a random number like 1 through 10 and find the variance or squared standardizing constant of today, it is 2.872, called the standard deviation. But back in the quantum mechanics was a new publication battleground. Numbers 1 to 9 had a sum of square differences from the mean of 82.5 or 9.166 on average, compared with the square root of 82.5, which is 9.083. Today, the same sample variance is 10.3125 because of the modern adjustment in size of the sample. Even after Cornfield and Tukey discovered the normal distribution, the correction for gamma was not added to the definitive application notes for that paper until, if I'm right, about sometime in the 1960s. Only then measurements became a precision scientific tool to validate any difficult or multifaceted cause and effect assertion. The modern error is due to Max Born and Nazi weapons research. They like to preach about waves being nothing but information about the wave, or particles of mass not moving like a water wave in axial directions. If any sequence of integers is used as a random number with limits at the beginning and end, i.e. 1 through 9, then n to 1, or n minus 1 or 8 is a sample size, and also the number of distances between all perfectly random observations. It is similar to psi by Schrödinger. In 1900, the Copenhagen Conference, led by Niels Bohr, discoverer of the atom, tried to sort out the double slit experiment among conflicting results. Like design by committee usually ends, it scrambles data. None survives to this day. At that time, the only sensor available was a phosphor-coated piece of glass, which was used as a backstrike screen, as well as one or both slits, along with much lighter coating. This was measurement and observation. Measurement originally, I'm sure, refers to the black screen and observation to the slits before the light or a charge is sent through the general direction. First, we know that the pure state of energy is easy to hear in music, but impossible to describe in math. If you as a student understand the beaming effects of high-frequency sound, then you already understand the nature of digital and radio waves. When someone talks about light or object traveling a solid, constant speed, you'll realize the source must also be bending the truth. Gravitational mass, as well as inertia, is in interchange with cosmic particles and exotic waves. Nothing gets shorter or ticks slower in real situations. Linear direction is only one primary variable. It is opposite, in fact. Magnetic dipole waves are constant speed and slower and more curvy than photons, and originate in the microstructures of conducting materials called domains. The synergy of magnetic and electric charges is what the speed of light means, not the actual speed of electrons or groups of such. An example is when the standard of 48K sampling rate is tested against higher sampling rates. In theory, the 47,000 per second distribution contains all the sound information, but anyone who compares it will tell you that more information of sound can be heard in a higher sampling rate. Stereo began as an axial wave and a transverse wave, each ear getting middle and side waves, but that gave way to Schrödinger's stereo, where the volume of drums or other sources were decreased in one ear to give the effect of location of the source. All this matters in supersymmetry theory with three symmetric forces: time, charge, plus and minus, and parity, left and right, indicate radiation is always in transcendental pairs, like picture. These are all fully reversible, meaning time, or at least its effects, can flow backwards inside special loop time-space circles and lines in a way that mimics Einstein's general relativity. But this tossing out of the expansion of space constant meant that the formal attribution to his equations cannot be supported that way, or just maybe it does support it as part of the paratranscendental directional radiation. In a similar way, the above relative synergy we have known for hundreds of years now, that the driving or primary coil of a wire can be either wound for different effects of motor force versus energy to control force. First, axial transduction, or bilateral space, as the transduction of a speaker driven along its axis by a coil wound along the long axis. Or secondly, radian or unilateral induction, which is used by dual coil transformers to cause an expanding and collapsing field effect around the secondary coil by inducing energy into a core, which then has synergistic interactions to increase the centrality of the located field. The Königsberg electric motor is presently a world leader in this type of advanced electric drive. Often, this core becomes magnetized over time. We know that the complex interaction within the atom that makes for a high content of energy and not the mass-heavy particle portions. That effect in the new time thinking is just another way that two nearby bodies exchange entanglement, thus becoming known more for its resemblance to information than to entropy. Remember in my work called The Last and Lost Physics Model that I stated that the truth about the so-called wave-particle duality is not that the two states of particle and the time itself is a wave-related variable, not easily fit into Cartesian coordinate or sequentially incremented number systems. Generalization has been overdone. The new ideas about time being perception of information that has lost its consolidation occurs and leaves open the advanced thinkers to examine backflows of time, which in fact have been demonstrated in many newer double slit and sensor experiments. Likewise, other experiments with light waves have slowed down the speed of light to as much as walking pace, leaving the previous presumption that light speed is transcendental to the variability we see on non-light situations in the dust. Furthermore, the challenges to long-established thinking about time-space have now run up against long-held belief systems that space warps into curves by gravity. Yet the beliefs persist that it expands like a bread dough in an oven and the universe thus ages. The WMAP probing shows no such background capacitance noise at all. And in this way, the red-shifted spectra of more distant stars could be explained without introducing forbidden assertions that the entanglement over a long chain of enveloped particles must go from a pure state to a more entangled one. The relationship of the observer to the observed is unchanged since the die-off of scientists, the ties to Nazi Austria in early the 20th century. Einstein was one of only a few that survived World Wars I and II and found employment in the United States in spite of this. These institutions supported his older publishing because he was not without financial resources. He did not, however, publish more work. He perhaps realized that the spiral galaxy-shaped S-curves meant slower moving gas already has been drawn into the centers of galaxies, leaving fast-moving gas. They were only fuzzy in Newton's time until the 1920s, but he was stuck with Newton and Henry Cavendish constants in the equations. In 2015, an F-18 jet launched from the Nimitz carrier battle group was tracked for 35 minutes and in constant visual contact and electronic validation of an unidentified advanced operational aircraft, as they're referred today. The public learned of this mostly during the revisionist changes and redaction of gravity as particles rhetoric. During the Middle Paleozoic period, the Earth also seems to have lost its magnetic field. I linked this to the loss of gravitation effects on the Earth, which made the construction of the Paleolithic structures like the Great Pyramid possible. The association of a tomb with a very probable is not just a human tomb. It appears to be a tellurite in construction method, and about the size of the sarcophagus at least, and the hallway heights. The size of the pyramid halls, the occupants scales to the height of Bob Lazar's 55-foot diameter ancient anti-gravity spacecraft, more in line with 34 inches. This is not shorter than the giant size of East Arabia's Anunnaki. Hermetic texts describe these gods as a tellurite race, short alien types. If the loss of magnetic waves or the redirection or displacement influences gravitational stability, it would then be a link to the now popular notion that there's a loss of information. This experiment is looking for a very small but noticeable link based on the premise that the Earth did not really lose all its magnetic field, but the field was being redirected outward into empty space or towards the moon, or counter-rotation of the magnetic molten core. Then if multiple particle attraction formulas for synergy like I gave previously in the last physics model can replace the current belief system of gravitation resulting from Nordstrom and Minkowski space-time prototypes and warping, it would mean magnetism changes, or at least has a greater role that it plays in changing nature of the surface pull of gravity on the Earth to subjects on its surface. I think these practical reasons alone should govern over theory in regard to merit, and not vice versa. It seems more likely compared with the Higgs particle, which was, until 2015, also driving the majority of popular culture's reactions to new ideas of the new understanding of time and space. I abbreviate that NUTS. Well, I am, by my channel's name, a critic of the social sciences, of especially what they call mental revelations. I have to obey my own critical guidelines. Even as it stands, I have single-handedly invented the field of archeophysics. To recognize deep age high tech is to progress forward. The only degree you get or need by watching my channel is sending Bitcoin to my address or the Tiki Peak, all one word, at Patreon. This is pretty much the same as a professional astrophysics education these days. So one question about the Great Pyramid and archeophysics is, why did it have to be so big? The blocks could not be molded unless you allow hundreds of times what is estimated for the construction time to set and the cure time that it would build this according to pharaonic texts. They were afraid inscriptions can be erased, perhaps, even though they are very difficult to modify. Maybe they were erased. But any knowledge as a field of study cannot stand alone. It depends upon how you view past events, such as the demise of quantum mechanics and its rebranding as particle physics and superficial statistical theory that was substituted for this Schrodinger's equation, back when the description of a simple random variable was yet to be someday a breakthrough in mathematics. Those who said that about the original quantum theory had no experience in mathematics, but they did have education and they wanted to use it. Education was not something to be challenged or changed. People had more trust in progress. Then Einstein was trying to improve the definition of gravitation and light effects. He could not throw out the old simple equations, even if he had measurements of planet movement and stability like I am trying to present here. So he used the idea of time-space just bending and moving in different coordinate systems of curvature, which was an idea still worked on, called the Poincare conjecture. He had died in 1912, and Einstein was working on this since 1907. Schrödinger invented the one-valent quantum field equation, and others added things like weapons-related equations of energy. Until then, discussions aimed math at particle versus gas density and determined the nature of electric or electronic charge. It was not the equation of the evil doctors of math porn that wanted to kill, but rather the threat of the possible psi as a dual multiple of its rate of change of its position times the location of the exact position of the particle in time and space, as it is derived in the psi wave, without the square or the square root of the positional value of the equation, without any momentum of the atom movement or heat. It could be that the Austrian physics, through such square terms, leads to discovery of more ancient energy and field statistical mechanics, even if it takes a long time to come out in the open. For example, in my personal work collection, I can show a proof that the Great Pyramid's volume, if computed in cubic long cubits, will then result in a date, which points to the year of construction, or at least design, but not necessarily built. Metric meters from the precision measurements can be converted to cubits. Cubits by a factor of 2.2222222 times cubic meters. I found that the orbit of Earth as a path in space, that is a cycle that can be envisioned as a long string of long cubits, as a material aid, not as a revelation like some relativity computations. That path length has only been correctly computed as a formula by Srinivasa Ramanujan, who, when I was a student, his work that I studied in high school was called Worthless and a Mentally Ill Person's Rants, obsessed with no education and no communications abilities. He used only the width of an ellipse and added a few basic metrics to accomplish his never before or since equaled equation. It's style very similar to my own research and development. He used chalk on the patio entry of a temple in India, which was left to wash away in the rain. Earth's orbit's length in meters times conversion factors to three-dimensional space is, 942 billion divided by 2.22222 equals 2,093,333,124 cubic cubits. Then 209,333,000. Let me see here. Yes, 2,093,333 million orbit divided by 180,55555, or 18,055,555 cubic cubits in the Great Pyramid is equal to 115.9384535,119. We just proceed with dividing by the 18,055,555.55 cubits of space volume of the pyramid into 1 cubic square box of Earth's orbit. We should see a result of 115.9384, and it shows an obvious correlation with days in the Earth's year. Now it's 365 divided by 115.938453 is a little over 3.14, which is like the number pi of 3.14159. Then, to match exactly with an Earth's year, we adjust the length of time of the year to 364.23 days today, so that we get 3.14158, which that gives us an explanation in the year of the year in deep time when the design was rendered, about 5 million years ago. We were large apes and small chimpanzees at that time. And this also gives the area of the pyramid as a string of 1 cubic blocks. It's 0.000000003 of Newton's gravitational wavelength in meters, which is 3.0028 times 10 to the minus 11th divided by the quantity 1 times 10 to the minus 16th n quantity light years. And that is 1.44 times 10 to the 10th distance in meters. That in cubits would be 3.2 exactly, times 10 to the 10th, or 3.2 divided by 10 billion, 10 billion light years. Compare Newton's universal constant G equals 6.673 times 10 to the minus 11th Newton per meter squared kilograms over kilograms squared. Well, that divided by the cubit, a conversion factor of 2.22 repeated 2 is then 3.00285 exponent minus 11. Working in the light year, which is a quantity 3.10 to the 11th divided by the quantity 1.057 divided by 10 to the 16th times 2.222 n quantity light years, and that is 6.306 e to the minus 27th distance in cubits. So using the Great Pyramid, I should maybe adjust Newton's universal G from 6.673 times negative 10 to the 11th to 6.306, or better yet, my creative universal G of 0.63161877, just divided by 1 billion, not 10 billion. I previously showed it works best just as is as a cosine, but then justifies a centripetal force and not the centrifugal force or diminishing observational force in gases and planet-like bodies. Now, to compare this with the original Schrodinger equation of psi, the rate of change of psi, divided by the quantity 8 pi squared, and quantity mass divided by the quantity h squared, and quantity divided by total energy, times psi equals 0, where h is Planck's constant divided by 2 pi, total energy is potential energy plus momentum energy, psi itself is a closed box, is a square root equation. There are no known relativistic effects. I can simplify a box with psi x equals square root of 2 divided by the length times the quantity nx divided by ln quantity x and quantity. There could be a box of 3.14159 1-cubic boxes set into Earth's orbit for each of the 3.14115 cubic box segments to make each segment a unit of rotation of pi days. Schrodinger kept up his lifelong belief that battle holding to his belief of psi squared is the actual position, the density of normal all parts of the wave. This formula looks similar to the magnetic reluctance. Reluctance is a form of resistance. It is what keeps purely magnetic devices small in size to reduce lost energy, which electromagnetic forces need larger spaces to interact efficiently. This is a bit like saying that the position equation directly gives the particle wave duality solution, and that it looks for the following reason. There certainly is duality, but it comes from my picture model and not from the reinvented idea of superposition theory, or the idea of psi squared is the only data point that is part of the simplified random independent distribution and only gives data that tells us the probability that the particle occupies a small region of space at a particular point in time segment baselines. This is briefly how the idea of information slowly was forced into general physics discussions. Where it was badly out of place. When you hear that word information, it really means statistical computation of data, and lost information is really a meaning only in the context of infinities in mathematics, which are common in the study of energy systems and stability. Yet telescopes show one simple ratio to be responsible for stability between planets. The belief that Schrodinger wrote that energy density variation determines the position of the electron in a wave, he meant it as a two-dimensional orbital that was some 3 dimensionals in space, like a wave crest. The position was one of many wave crests, like a suborbital within an orbital. It was not the exact precise location within space that for some light speed instant you could find it. Not by any means, not anyone at the turn of the century, even now, would believe this in electronics. But it does relate to what we need to be aware of to do calculations based in time, in which we want to define a clock tick. Quantum theory states there is no clock tick precisely, because it is a shift of wave crests. It radiates a pulse or wave when it reaches that position, defining the type of intensity of radiated energies in a number of ways. Suppose my cat was in a box. Cats sleep 80% of the time, so I do not know if the cat is dead or alive, or asleep. Substituting a probability for a location of a heartbeat is like asking the question, is the cat dead or alive? And concluding that both are true until the observer looks inside and sees. I paraphrase this critical view of observational systems theory. Even his response has been given as a sort of Nazi sick tradition humor twist. We were talking about 1930s Germany physics education. Duality then was more determinism than idealism. In 1933, the Austrian citizen Schrödinger won the Nobel Prize and left Germany because he was removed for being of Jewish blood. He was the only scientist in the quantum mechanics realm to ever have published a wave function energy theory, and others at the time in Germany, notably Max Born, used statistical averages, even though the formula for a random variable variation was never even discovered until about 1955. In 1935, Max Born was the Nobel Prize winner, and a letter from Hitler was sent telling Born to keep up his great publication, and was dubbed the father of quantum mechanics. Born replaced Schrödinger. In my opinion, that was a cruel Nazi joke. What should have been done for quantum mechanics to become new as a science was to make the random variable a true random variable instead of a pseudo-random one like Max Born had the rights to, as if it was a wave description. He simply reinterpreted waves as a statistical physical thing, each small sample randomly but infinitesimally contributing to some grand whole. But this really covered the drill down into the works of the atoms as sums of averages of waves and their speed being de Broglie and Schrödinger's groundwork. This is just like the volt really is two forms of volts. The Austrians who financed the Nazi Party, anything squared is determined a deterministic model. It was just too difficult to comprehend. This was a time when science was going underground. As I have shown, then you have an equation like the pictured equation that yields the same result whether you write it as a double square root or as two single square roots. But you have opened Pandora's box. You now see I have added a constant to each respective equation and used the two together as a synergistic system or simultaneous equations as an algebra. You have to find by trial and error the constant of the second form of the equation which matches the outcome of the first. This then can become the reciprocal process or trade and borrow form of each other in time. And that, according to the theory of synergistics, is why we experience time as segments in time, and not all at once as a simple infinity. So let me explain infinities and the role that they play. It fits with instantaneous entanglement information transfer theories, and in fact enables almost all new gravity theory. A square wave may be well expected to have different infinities than, for instance, a sine wave does. The number is 7071. Never happens in either a sine wave or a cosine wave form. I have done what I can in the time I have to cover the picture and quantum mechanics original equations. Too close related to ignore, but there is more to say about this and radiation. This simple particle in a box creates a wave of quantum mechanics like in an atom, because it is a moving thing like a wave. There is a center point, which is the center of the volume of space that forms a boundary condition like an atom and its orbital electrons. I should explain a more simple model of a plate that is heated on one side and moves the heat like a wave to the cold side of the motion of the planets of the plate. This was first done by Isaac Newton. Newton showed that you can do math as a version of cooling only one way. You can also do it by changing each region of a cell of a spreadsheet a little bit like a domino effect, changing the next region of space or cell and continuing on. But you can do that so that easily you can still show curvature of distributions, which results if there is any variation, such as more heat in one area or denser on one side of the same thickness of plate. To do a good job, Newton used an infinite plate, or equal density, where cooling was available on one side evenly and heating on the other. It turns out that you can, if you need an upside down matrix of cells to be combined with the top set of cells to get an average or stable calculation, which is called the relaxation method of computation. Newton's method refers to the split of plate in half, or the center of the becomes a zero value. The hot side of the high value and the cold side a low value in the initial setup. This may be one-directional universe G and how it started. Of course, at the initial conditions, the center starts to approximate an arithmetic average. With a perfectly infinitely precise calibrated, this is always true even if the energy being applied to the hot side remains constant. If the heat source energy remains a constant and the plate is very large or infinite, then what will happen is the center line of the plate will never change position information at all. But the catch there is that it takes an infinite amount of time and calculation for that perfect average to happen. The new wave thinking is that it never does, but there is a good match for what we can observe as energy, and the energy being transduced across the material in the plate axially in the axial directions. Because the plate is finite, we do not see the relaxation of energy curves or waveforms. Yet even without a wave or arrow of time, it becomes apparent. If you believe, as did Ernst Mach and my picture work shows, or what the Great Pyramid's unique geometry is supposed to tell the world, then by using square roots in the math of the center of coordinate systems based on cosines of the 50.8 degrees angle and the 51.8 degrees angles, can then reach up toward a vertex that does not exist except in one's imagination, or an infinity, or an average. The pyramid implies both radial and axial magnetic and electric energies. Both resulting forces are caused by charge, the magnetic and stationary charge. It may also be required of a magnetic synergy that the radial field of gravity of the Earth must be built and its components manufactured and lifted into place. As space itself was expanded, the one was located near a source of heat, the expansion was driven by heat, then likewise the average temperature between the 2 points would appear to remain constant if the plate thickness or amount of matter or gas is constant. That expanding gas is known to be measurable always as a cooler temperature, and again, if energy is never destroyed, then how could entropy explain something such as a molecular heat vibration showing as not being a destruction of energy? It radiates outward and inward. This, even on average, the distribution of heat value is slowly widening its dispersion into an infinity. It has always been considered to be a particle resonance and not pure energy. You must have to add more space to the math to do, and then you have energy back with no complications, except the Schrodinger function of a wave no longer locates things where they were. When charges are moving, they're no longer pure magnetic, but must transition into a static or electric charge governed by Coulomb's constant K. Magnetic means a constant rate of movement in 3 dimensions. If these electric fields are 2-dimensionals, inward force negative or outward positive, but if both at once gives a stable resultant force. Yet if distances are increasing between the charges, they are reduced in force by the square of the radius between them and not the distance between them. The solution there is a positive and negative charge oscillation in a conductor's electrons that it's beginning to be thought of as an instant wave outside of the metal conductors. nearly all the forces are conveyed actually in the form of two-dimensional charges of electric and static state fields. They are moving along the path of that conductor. Radio waves are considered to be a light wave speed and have no loss of force. But they do appear to have take a long time with instantaneous entanglement. So if both sources of charges are the same thing, why would they have two different behavior patterns if it is not due to energy or synergies of information that allows the speed of light coupling to occur in actual movement for the moving charge like radio, but not for all the other nearly stationary standing magnetic wave charges? But what does the total energy in the universe mean, other than that it provides a way to make an easy explanation and non-symmetrical wonderment that does not match our human experience on Earth? The difficult question seems to be avoided as a movement of space itself. If special relativity means that stationary charges have their time measured differently from moving particles, but that, then again, magnetic force does not travel as far out in space is the presumption, somewhat dubious, that gravity forces and relativistic radio forces travel at a much greater unknowable distance. It's just a matter of chalking up boards with the appropriate time differentials between particle charges that are identical. The work of Edgar Arthur Milne and Schrödinger was eventually replaced. Milne spotted the fact that oscillations of atoms contributed more to the total energy of systems than his special relativity said that they did, because that is where the charge force originates. His work remains rare and almost unobtainable. In my opinion, a much more rational theory would involve imaginary numbers. It could be field energies equals speed of light squared. The work of Erwin Schrödinger, educated in Austria, like Albert Einstein, spotted the fact that if you take the sum of all squares of this psi wave and lump them into a big basket of random variable probability, like one big oscillation, you likewise eliminate the contribution of axial versus radial directional transfers if everything is now a one-directional beacon instead of two-dimensional electron charge atoms and unique properties of three-dimensional world co-charges as my picture model. The statistical summation idea came from work on gases which do not exhibit group behavior. But inspiration, Louis de Broglie had chosen the glory that his manner of waves and predicting the nature of waves from France was using the term quantum mechanics for approximately 12 years before Schrödinger began. Long before Max Born, Louis de Broglie began his work about 2 years after Bohr's lead of the Copenhagen Coffee Group about 1922. Schrödinger published monthly. Erwin never needed the contribution of 8 pi tossed in as a fudge factor to compensate. Only the momentum due to movement, combined with this potential energy, which increases in distance between the emitter and the receiver as they increase. No such distance has ever been since it's what became the closed society of rethinking, and already obvious ways to seem clever by using spherical or flat contained geometries driving the circular logic of in some fashion that makes no difference in the eventuality of real-world physics. The challenge of designing even a simple beacon is not even assisted one bit by the sweat hog exercises in general physics that should be done in education. But it is all really coffee shop physics. Erwin Schrödinger also knew that the false assertion that there was an active role for the observer and a double split experiment was false. It was a false finding of the Copenhagen coffee shop project aimed at destructive efforts to explain why a phosphor screen shows axial movement in 2D charges as dots. His electron orbital was not two-dimensional, but was still taught in classic chemistry today, but as a 3D wave. There is an oscillation introduced by doing that, the frequency of which depends upon the distance of the area between the slits, vertical and horizontal. This brings in conjecture that if black holes are non-luminous, then they may as well have a spectrum beyond our ability to sense and a frequency rate to account for its interference pattern on visible light. That is all the observer dependency could have meant, the difference in apparatus construction. The more constant the speed through the entire path of the energy system, the more magnetic in nature that it is, and the less two-dimensional nature, as previously described, becomes the dominant mode of propagation. The wave all around the high current wire forms its own EM wave in theory in electric engineering textbooks today.